So my computer basically just gave up on me completely a few days ago, and to make a long story short, I had to wipe the hard drive and reinstall Windows. And as I was getting ready to set up GameMaker again, I thought to myself, I never made a video on the Yoyo Compiler, did I? And since I'm going to have to go through the whole song and dance of getting the Yoyo Compiler ready to go at some point or another, let's talk about it. So for those unaware, GameMaker Studio has two modes of operation. There is the regular mode that you're probably used to using, which is the GameMaker Virtual Machine, and there is the Yoyo Compiler. The GameMaker Virtual Machine is what is set to run by default and doesn't really require any setup besides just installing GameMaker. What it does when you run the game is it will turn your GML code into a semi-compiled form of what is known as bytecode, which is basically machine code which is specific to GameMaker. It's a custom machine code that GameMaker uses and can execute. And then as your game is running, it just executes the bytecode. And most of the time this is fine, there's not really any problem with it. If you're a power user, you probably realize that GML is not the fastest language in the universe, but it gets the job done. The Yoyo Compiler, on the other hand, has a very different approach. Instead of turning your GML into a customized bytecode format that the GameMaker Virtual Machine can execute, the Yoyo Compiler will instead turn your code into C++, and then, as the name implies, it will just compile the C++. As a consequence of this, your game should run and function exactly the same way that it did before when you were running it in the GameMaker Virtual Machine, with the added bonus that it should be much, much faster. Sounds great, right? There are actually quite a few drawbacks to using the Yoyo Compiler, but I'll get to those in due time. Let's go ahead and set up the Yoyo Compiler. So to do this, you are going to need an external tool, and some of you may already have this installed, but what you're going to need is going to be something called Microsoft Visual Studio. There are a bunch of different versions of Microsoft Visual Studio that have been released over the years. The most recent one, as of my recording this, is Visual Studio 2019. I am not 100% sure if that first search result is, like, legitimate or just trying to get me to install malware or something, so I will be editing that out. So anyway, you can just type Microsoft Visual Studio into your search engine of choice, go to the first result that is actually part of the Microsoft website. I will put a link to this in the description of this video, but Microsoft does seem to like to move stuff around on their website somewhat frequently, and if you're watching this far in the future, it may not be there anymore, and you may want to just type Visual Studio into your search engine of choice anyway. There's a couple different editions of it. There's Community, which is the free version. There are two different professional versions, which is what you're going to be using if you are doing this for, like, your job or something. Community is fine. You don't have to pay Microsoft anything to install Visual Studio and to get the Yoyo Compiler up and running. So when you click on this, it's going to just download a installer onto your computer.
Hey.
If you have any form of security on your computer whatsoever, you will see the user account control popping up asking if it's okay for this software to install. And now we've got to install some specific components. This is not one of the most straightforward pieces of software installation in the world, because there are quite a few components to Microsoft Visual Studio for doing different things. Once it finishes extracting the installation information, we will walk through this, and I will explain which parts you need. By the way, Yo-Yo Games does at the current moment officially recommend Visual Studio 2017, but I've been using Visual Studio 2019 for the Yoyo Compiler for a while, and I have not had any problems with it, other than problems with, like, my own code. So at this point in time, you should be pretty safe with Visual Studio 2019. Anyway, once you see this page, and it'll look different if you are using a different version of Visual Studio for whatever reason, you will want to install desktop development with C++. That will add a bunch of these modules. Not all of them are necessary. I'm going to uncheck all of these, and the ones that you specifically need for GameMaker. And that's it, right? The Visual Studio modules that you specifically need for GameMaker is going to be Microsoft Visual C++. This is the main thing. It includes the actual compilers as well as a bunch of different code libraries that your game may or may not need. Next, the Windows 10 SDK. There's a couple different versions of this. I would just go with the most recent one, whatever that happens to be at the current moment in time when you're trying to install this. You're also going to need the C++ ATL, which is some other code libraries and such that may or may not be needed, and C++ MFC, more of the same. If you plan on using Microsoft Visual Studio for things other than GameMaker, if you plan on doing other software development, if you plan on using Unity, you may be interested in other things in this list. But I am not going to confuse things by trying to install, for example, the Unity tool sets, which I am sure I will be needing at some point in time. The next time I want to open up Unity. If you like Python or Node.js, there are tool sets for those as well. But anyway, I'm just going to install this because this is already going to have to install 7 gigabytes of stuff, and that's going to take a while. So prepare to be sitting here for a while. First, it's got to download all of the materials. Then it has to actually install all of the materials, and that can take a while. As a bit of a fun fact, somewhere on the GameMaker help desk, it does actually claim that you need Visual Studio for a couple other things, including but not limited to building 64-bit versions of your game. But I have actually not found that to be the case. I do not have Visual Studio installed right now. It's doing that now, as you can see. And I'm able to run 64-bit versions of my GameMaker games just fine. I'm not exactly sure what Yoyo Games mean by that. You also do need to use Visual Studio if you want to build games using the Microsoft Universal Windows Platform. I think that's what UWP stands for. If you've never used that before, if you've never built a game for it, or if you've just never even heard of it before, that's okay, because pretty much nobody has. It's basically Microsoft's attempt to make desktop software everywhere look like software that's running on a cell phone. It's not my favorite thing ever. Anyway, if you do want to do that, you will also need Visual Studio installed. If you want to build a game for consoles, you'll also need Visual Studio installed. Although, for what it's worth, if you're getting ready to build a game for a console, you probably already know most, if not all, of this stuff already, and I don't have to tell you that. Anyway, this is going to take a while. Feel free, while this is downloading and installing, to go get a bite to eat, go take your dog for a walk or something like that. I am going to cut away from the video, and I will be back whenever it finishes. It may or may not prompt me to restart my computer when it finishes. If it does that, then you can just restart your computer. But anyway, it's a nice day out today. I'm gonna go take my dog for a walk. Okay, I am back. It does say, Visual Studio does say that a reboot is required. I am going to go and do that, and I will be back in a minute. Okay, we are back, and GameMaker is booting up, and Visual Studio had promised me when I turned the computer off that it would restart installation when I came back, and it has not done that. I believe, however, that it should be good to go. I see the icon has installed in the Windows taskbar, in the Windows start menu. Anyway, you can boot up Visual Studio if you want. You can poke around in it. It's a pretty cool piece of software. I know that Windows as a whole tends to get a lot of fun poked at it for it being a bit of a mess, but Visual Studio is actually really nice. There's a lot of stuff in it, but it's got a lot of useful stuff in it too if you're interested in developing software. Anyway, what we're interested in for GameMaker is if I were to go and open up the... Which one was I looking at? I was looking at this one. This is the first test I'm going to run on it. This is Visual Studio is asking me to sign in. Not now, thank you, actually. I will not be doing that. Not in this video. If you go into File, Preferences, and if you go to down here, Platform Settings, there's a different entry for each of the exports that you have, each of the export modules that you have, except for Ubuntu, apparently. And if you go to Platform Settings and Windows, there are two options right now, as of the current version of GameMaker. You have Create Zip Archive, and this is just the default behavior when you click the Build Game button. And below that, you have the Visual Studio location, and it may or may not, by default, have a file path already in the little text box here. If you do have a file shown here, it may or may not actually be correct. Regardless, I do recommend deleting that and clicking the little menu thing and locating the version of Visual Studio yourself, because it does differ between versions of Visual Studio. Assuming you installed it in the default location, this should just be for Visual Studio 2019. Your main Windows hard drive, go to Program Files x86, which is where the 32-bit applications live. Go to Microsoft Visual Studio, go to 2019, Community, we're after that, VC, and Auxiliary, Build, yes, it's a long file path. and vcvars32.bat is the file that we're looking for. If you are using a different version of Visual Studio, I will put the locations where they install to by default on the screen right now. If you're watching this video in the deep future and Visual Studio 2021 or 2023 has installed the program in a different location, type into Google where to find the vcvars batch file in Visual Studio, whatever my version is, and you should be able to find it that way. You should be able to find someone on the internet to who can tell you. Anyway, let's just select that file, and this is the correct file location for Visual Studio. This is how GameMaker knows where to find all the build tools that it needs to compile the C++ that it's going to generate from your GML code. Okay? Okay. So now let's talk about how the Yoyo Compiler actually performs. So the Yoyo Compiler will not provide the same performance boost to all kinds of code. There are some kinds of code, there are some tasks that you may wish to do in game dev that may see more or less of a performance boost from the Yoyo Compiler. It will not automatically double your FPS real or anything like that. If you have a game that's very heavy on graphics, and I know that there are a lot of people who follow my YouTube channel for stuff regarding 3D games in GameMaker, and I'm about to disappoint a large number of you right now, because if you have a game that's very heavy on graphics, you will see a small boost in performance when using the Yoyo Compiler, but it's not going to be anything amazing. It's not going to be, as I've called it in the other 3D optimization videos that I've done, it's not going to be a silver bullet. And the Yoyo Compiler is not automatically going to make your 3D game perform well on all kinds of hardware where it would have struggled earlier. If, however, your game is very heavy on logic and it's very heavy on math, or if you're making a real-time strategy game which has a lot of enemy units on the screen at once, or, for example, I guess this is technically an RTS, but the Tower Defense series that I'm making right now on YouTube as a series might possibly have a lot of enemy units and might possibly have a lot of bullets and that sort of thing on the screen at once. Those are the sorts of games which the Yoyo Compiler can look quite favorably upon. So this example here, I'm going to have something that resembles a game in a minute, but first I'm going to look at this, and this is just a quick sort. I wrote my own sorting algorithm. My own sorting algorithm. I implemented a sorting algorithm in GameMaker. This is what it looks like. It's a lot of code. It's a lot of GML code that runs a lot of times in a big loop. It's actually a recursive function, which isn't quite the same as a loop. But you can see that it's doing a bit of math. It's doing a little bit of comparisons to see if some value is greater than or less than another, and it's doing a lot of variable assignments and that sort of thing. It's doing a lot of function calls. It's calling a lot of functions that I wrote specifically, not just GameMaker function calls. And this is a test demo that I've written to demonstrate such the point. And this is just going to generate a list of 500 first and last names. And in the step event, it's going to randomize the list, and then it's going to sort them using that sorting algorithm, which I have written here. And then it's just going to time this code and see how long it takes to run. And we can see on the screen it is taking about more or less 4 milliseconds to run this entire sorting algorithm each time. Okay, if I were to scale this up, if I were to make it 1,000, it would take I want to say a little more than twice that. Might be about 10 milliseconds to run. Okay. 8 or 9. Quicksort scales decently well. Looks like it's converging on 8 milliseconds. I like Quicksort. It's probably officially my favorite sorting algorithm. God, that's a weird thing to admit to having. And that's not bad. That's 120 frames per second. 8 milliseconds is about 120 frames per second. You're probably not going to be doing things like sorting a list that big in the step event constantly, but if you do, there you have it. Now, when it comes to the Yoyo Compiler, to enable that, once you have Visual Studio installed, once you have the Yoyo Compiler set up in GameMaker, you can just go to this drop-down here, Platform Windows, Worker Local. Remote workers is an interesting subject. Output, you're going to select YYC instead of VM. The device is going to be default, and the config is going to be the default. Now, run the game. You may wish to, when you do that, click the little broom icon to clear the compile cache just in case, but regardless, we can just run the game. It's going to take longer to run because full code compilation, full C++ compilation is noticeably more involved, and it's a noticeably more expensive operation than simply converting your GML code into the GameMaker bytecode. But we can see that once we've done that, the average sorting time has gone down by more than half. So this was taking about 8 milliseconds to run. The first time I ran this, but now it's taking less than 3.5. And that's definitely significant. If we're going to be talking about FPS real, 8 milliseconds would afford you about 120 FPS real, and 3.5 milliseconds would afford you something closer to 250 to 300 FPS real. If you were to go by that metric. This is definitely significant. Now, let's talk about a kind of program where this might not show you the same improvements. So I'm going to open up another window of GameMaker, and I'm going to open up another test project that I have. By the way, quicksort, and I should have done this earlier, but just in case you want to see that quicksort is actually doing its job and not just running a bunch of random lines of code, if I were to run this again, I've added some code that if you hit the spacebar, it'll print out the first 200 names on the screen, in the console rather. And if you look at the console, you can see that we do indeed have an entire laundry list of random Roman citizens sorted by last name and then first name. So if you want to look through that, I wonder how many of these were coincidentally like real people's names at some point in history 2,000 years ago. Probably most of them. Ancient Rome did not have a ton of variation in what we would today call first names. Hey. Anyway, this is a project that some of you may recognize if you've been around my YouTube channel, except there is suddenly a lot more of it. This is the test project that I like to use to demonstrate various things when it comes to simple like 2D games and that sort of thing. I ran a version of this on the Raspberry Pi when I was setting that up not too long ago. Well, half a year ago now. There's a lot more of it now. You can play Where's Waldo with the duck, and there are something in the realm of probably about 1,000 dogs on screen right now, and they're all walking around. They're drawing their own sprites and that sort of thing. If you look at the frame time overlay in the corner of the screen, you can see that we've got about 4.5 seconds is about how long it's taking to render and draw each frame. So that's going to be about 225 FPS real, if you're going by that metric. And if I were to go over and switch this down to the Yoyo Compiler instead, you would see that we are still going to see some improvement in the amount of time that it takes to update and draw each frame, but it's not going to be nearly as dramatic as the very logic-heavy quicksort. You can see that if I'm going to give it a second or so to sort of average out, we were at about, 4.75 FPS real before, 4.5, and now it looks more like we're going to be about 3 1/3 or so. So we're still seeing an improvement. It's definitely not nothing, but it's closer to, I want to say, about a 30% reduction in frame time instead of, what was it before, like 60% that we were seeing with quicksort. So it certainly affects some types of code better than others. And let's see, I don't think we would really see anything if I hit the spacebar and talk to somebody, would we? Because this isn't like any this is hardly any code that's running at all. It's just a single draw sprite and a single draw text. Anyway, that's I see we've changed the font and the debug overlay. That is the Yoyo Compiler. So some issues that you may want to be aware of in the Yoyo Compiler. I know this all sounds great, but we are going to have some trade-offs when it comes to doing this, when it comes to using the Yoyo Compiler. One of those, and probably the first one that you'll notice, is the amount of time that it takes your games to compile. So when you run your games through the GameMaker virtual machine, it doesn't take that long to compile. When you write more code, it doesn't really take that much longer for your games to start when you hit the run button. Most of the time, if it takes a long time to build your game using the GameMaker virtual machine, it's because you have a lot of sprites and a lot of audio, and those are somewhat more expensive to package together into the game than just your code is. But when it comes to the Yoyo Compiler, and you may have even noticed this when I was running these tests just here, it can take a lot longer to compile your code. And like I said earlier, that is because the first GameMaker has to translate your code into C++, and then GameMaker has to ask Microsoft Visual Studio and the build tools that come with it to compile the C++.
Hey.
And compiling C++ to machine code is, as I said, quite a lot more expensive than just converting GameMaker language to the bytecode. And if you have a relatively small project like these, you may notice that it takes a couple more seconds to run your game than it used to, and that's not too big of a deal. But if you have a large project with thousands and thousands of lines of code, you could very easily find yourself sitting there for 15 minutes waiting for your game to compile. And GameMaker will do some optimizations. It will, if you don't change your code between runs of the game, it will cache the compiled code, or at least parts of the compiled code, so that it doesn't have to do the whole thing over again. And that can and often does speed up the amount of time it takes your games to compile. But if you have a lot of lines of code that need to compile, and especially if they're fairly complicated, you may have to be prepared to wait. And when you get down to it, compilation time is kind of one of the core trade-offs between compiled languages like C++ and interpreted languages, or semi-interpreted or virtual machine languages like GameMaker or JavaScript or Python. It's much faster to run an interpreted language or a language that runs in a virtual machine, such as GameMaker, but the resulting program can often be quite a lot slower. And sometimes that's not a problem. If you have a simple program, if you have a simple game, that may not be a problem. But if you have a complicated program, or if you have a complicated game, then that might be something that you care about. Also, in addition to just compiling your game to machine code, the C++ compiler itself does a lot of optimizations if you have code that's in your game but it's not actually referenced, or if you have something like a value that's calculated but never actually used, or a for loop that does absolutely nothing. The C++ compiler can and often will just remove that code completely so that it's not in your game at all. Compilers are actually really cool. Anyway, another consequence of using the GameMaker Yoyo Compiler is that debugging your code can be an absolute nightmare. Ordinarily, when you run your GameMaker games, and if you have an error in your code somewhere, I'm just going to misspell a variable or something like that in my code here to make it deliberately break. This variable is not correct. The variable that we're looking for should be talking, and that's going to be a reference to an instance which you are talking to. But instead, if I misspell it or something like that, this value is going to not exist, and GameMaker is going to complain. And let me stop that and change back to the virtual machine because I want to show that off in here first. We are going to see that our game crashes with an error message. This is variable objplayer.talk not set before reading it, and it shows the line of code on which that happens, and it shows the actual code as well as just the line number. And that's somewhat helpful. That's pretty helpful. That can tell you that you have to go to line 8 in objplayer's draw GUI event and fix whatever the problem is. If you do something like this in the GameMaker Yoyo compiler, there are a couple things that can happen, and pretty much all of them are less helpful than this. You may find, in some cases, that GameMaker just does not allow you to compile your code to begin with. You may find that the Yoyo compiler is smart enough to identify a variable which is not defined anywhere, and before your game even starts to run, it may tell you that there is an undefined variable on line 8 of the player's draw GUI event. That's the best case scenario, because that doesn't waste your time. You don't have to wait for the game to try to compile and then fail, and it tells you exactly what you have to do. What's more likely to happen is that instead you're just going to see a generic error message that says error in action number 1 of draw event for OBJ player, line 8, and it's not going to tell you what that error is, or it's not going to tell you what the code that is causing the error looks like the way it does when you run it in the virtual machine. It's just going to tell you that there's an error on line 8 in this event. And that's less helpful, but it's still usable. That's still usable information. You can still go to that line of code, and unless it's like absurdly complicated and you're trying to fit an entire script in a single line of code, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, you can usually reasonably quickly figure out what's gone wrong, such as this, if you go to the line of code. What can also happen, and I do not have an example here with me because these errors tend to be unpredictable. What can also happen is sometimes your game will just terminate without throwing an error message, and you will have no idea why. And sometimes you can trace that down if you hit a key on the keyboard, if you click on an enemy, if you shoot a bullet or something like that. If you can track it down to a specific input that the player did, you can use that to track down where the error came from in your game. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it just happens when the player is standing idle. Sometimes it happens when, for example, some process runs in the background. If you have code that autosaves your game periodically every 5 minutes, and that causes an error, you may find that your game just randomly crashes. And sometimes your game will fail to build, it will fail to compile, but it will not provide a useful error message. Sometimes when you're compiling your game, and when you get to the build for architecture x86 or x64, depending, line, sometimes your game will just terminate after this line and it won't spit out an error message. Or sometimes your game will terminate and it will spit out an error message and it will be completely incomprehensible. I think I actually have a couple screenshots of this of what I like to call Yoyo Compiler vomit, which I will show on the screen right now. And this sort of thing will boil down to in the generated C++ that GameMaker tried to create. There is an error somewhere in that, and the Microsoft Visual Studio build tools do not know what to do with it. And since the generated C++ that GameMaker gives you is often utterly incomprehensible, the error messages will be utterly incomprehensible. There's a bit of an art to debugging what I like to call Yoyo Compiler vomit. Sometimes, if you do run into your Yoyo Compiler code behaving unusually, what you can do, and this is something that you'll probably find yourself doing more often in Yoyo Compiler mode than in regular GameMaker mode, but if you do clean your project cache, so click the little broom icon at the top of the IDE or hit Control F7, that will delete all of the temporary files that GameMaker creates and caches and has compiled so that it doesn't have to compile again if nothing changes. And that will force the Yoyo Compiler to start over from scratch, and if there's anything outdated in the cache that's causing issues, that will get rid of it. And sometimes you will find that solving your issues with compilation errors or other mysterious errors. If, for example, you deleted something in your code and suddenly you're getting an error message on the line of code that you deleted, sometimes cleaning the cache can work in those situations. You can also, if you know what you're doing, go directly into the GameMaker cache and delete the offending files so that GameMaker only has to recompile those files and it doesn't have to recompile the whole thing. But you should only be doing that if you know exactly what you're doing, and I will not be encouraging people to do that now. Normally, cleaning the project cache is something you only really have to deal with in GameMaker if you're having issues such as sprites or audio being messed up, because in the VM, GameMaker will not actually cache your code. If you're having an issue with your code and you're running the virtual machine, cleaning the cache will not help, because the only things in the cache will be stuff like graphics and sounds and stuff. This is something that I see people misunderstanding about the compile cache pretty frequently. It's not like a harmful misconception about GameMaker or development or anything like that, but yeah, it is a waste of time if you're running your game in the virtual machine and your code is crashing. With the Yoyo Compiler, however, it can definitely be something worth trying if you're having issues. So in theory, if your game works in the GameMaker virtual machine, if you run your game in VM mode, it should work exactly the same in Yoyo Compiler mode. In practice, unfortunately, the Yoyo Compiler is a really complicated and finicky beast. And there's a lot of different places where things can go wrong, and it does have a fair share of bugs, and there are certain things that work in the VM that do not work in the Yoyo Compiler, as well as rarely something that works in the Yoyo Compiler but does not work in the VM. Some of the veterans in the GameMaker Discord could tell you all about that. But anyway, if you use the Yoyo Compiler for a large game, do be prepared to spend a lot of time debugging. As scary as I probably just made it sound, the Yoyo Compiler is, and definitely has been for a lot of people, very useful when it comes to performance. The Yoyo Compiler is not, and a lot of people try to do this and run into problems, the Yoyo Compiler is not something that you can just tack on at the end of your game's development and build an executable and expect to work with a free performance boost. That is a really good way to find unusual issues. You really do have to regularly run the Yoyo Compiler on your game, even though it can take a long time to compile. Because that way, if your game crashes for some unknown reason, you can at least look at the last couple things that you changed, the last couple features that you added, the last couple commits in your source control commit history, and you can narrow down what the offending line of code might be that way, or why your code might be breaking. If you can narrow it down to a small number of lines of code that you only changed recently, and you know that your game is working before that, debugging arcane Yoyo Compiler issues definitely becomes a lot easier. And different people have different approaches to this. Some people just run their game exclusively using the Yoyo Compiler. Again, that can be fairly time-consuming, but it can also be a fairly reliable way to find issues. Some people like to run the Yoyo Compiler every time they finish a feature, or every time they make a commit, every time they make a working commit to their source control. Some people I know like to run the Yoyo Compiler just once a day on a regular basis on a schedule. Every time you pack up for the day to go home, every time you finish development for the day, you just run the Yoyo Compiler to see if it works. That sort of thing. If you do want to use this, if you do want to use the Yoyo Compiler to speed up your game, definitely find a strategy that works for you. Because if you have a system for this, and if you have a system for running it periodically and looking for errors in your code, it becomes a lot easier to use. Okay. Anyway, there's one more thing. I left this to the end because I don't know if it's actually going to be a huge benefit to a large number of people, more so than the other things that I've said. But I like to make games on the Raspberry Pi, or I should say I like to toy around with the Raspberry Pi anyway. actually making games for it can be a bit of work. For those who don't know, the Raspberry Pi is a miniature computer. It's a credit card sized computer, and it's about $40 worth of computer hardware. And you can install Linux on it, you can run games on it, and that sort of thing. I made a video a couple months ago about making GameMaker games for the Raspberry Pi, and all of the things that you need to set up to do so. And as it turns out, and if I can just start my HDMI screen capture on the Raspberry Pi so that I can actually show it in action. If you've done all your setup, and I will link the video where I set up the Raspberry Pi in the video description and in a card. But if you've already got this set up, and I'm just going to run the quicksort experiment on it as a test, because the other one with all the dogs might actually just make it catch fire and explode, and I don't want that to happen. But if your game is able to run on the virtual machine in the Raspberry Pi, you do not actually have to do anything else to set up the Yoyo Compiler. It'll just work. You don't have to install anything, you don't need to deal with build tools, you don't need to deal with makefiles or anything gross like that. When you set up GameMaker for the Raspberry Pi to begin with, that already included all of the things that you needed to make it work on the Yoyo Compiler mode. So this is running in the virtual machine. Not well, mind you, but it's running. And if I were to exit out of that, and if I were to switch GameMaker over to the Yoyo Compiler on Ubuntu on the Raspberry Pi, it'll probably take a little while to compile, because not only does GameMaker have to compile the code to C++ and C++ to machine code, but it also has to do it on the Raspberry Pi, which is going to be even slower than doing it on the main computer. Alright, that took a solid 45 seconds to get going. Again, you can see it's performing significantly better than it was before, but it just works in the Yoyo Compiler mode, and you don't have to do anything special in order to do that. Alright, excellent. If you're interested in developing games for Mac for Apple computers, I do not have access to any Apple products which I can actually test this on or experiment with, but there are instructions for things that you need to set up to get GameMaker games to run on Macs as well. And I hate to say the words in a video, go look at the documentation, but that's really all I can do right now because, again, I do not have any Apple products to test this on or to demonstrate on. Okay. I'm just going to leave the video on this very hypnotic scene of hundreds and hundreds of dogs walking around. That's it! If you want the demo projects that I've set up here, I will have links to a GitHub repository containing both of them in the video description. I am thinking about making another video on specifically dealing with Yoyo Compiler issues, because those can be a very big pain to deal with. But I would need to find ways to deliberately break my Yoyo Compiler games in interesting ways, which is surprisingly easier said than done given the nature of the errors. And additionally, the fact that Yoyo Games does occasionally fix the errors, so that sometimes if you just update GameMaker, it'll just start working again. I'll see if I can find any exciting ways to do that. Anyway, I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, there will be links to that in all the usual places. You can get some fun stuff that way, name in the credits, shout out at the end of the video, that sort of thing. Otherwise, I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, one of these and one of the aforementioned Let's Make a Tower Defense game. I hope you all found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Kiara Elizabeth, Connor, David Key, Edward Holt, Emily Koyo, Posho, Tusk, and Zenith for supporting these videos. If you want your name in the credits or to hear yourself shouted out at the end, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.